What's up everyone? This video is all about hitchhikers, mainly the top 5 that kinda suck. Hitchhikers make their way into home aquariums by stowing away on pieces of live rock and coral. Some are relatively benign, such as like the occasional feather duster worm, and there's even highly sought after hitchhikers, such as commensal hermit crabs that live in some stony corals. This video, however, is not about those types of hitchhikers. We're going to focus mainly on the top 5 most problematic pests. Before addressing my top 5, there are pests that are going to be noticeably absent from this list, so let's go ahead and give out some honorable mention awards. These pests can be annoying and prevalent, but just didn't quite make the cut for one reason or another. The first on the list of honorable mentions is Aiptasia. If you've never had them before, don't worry, it's just kind of a matter of time. They're extremely prevalent in the hobby and are a huge nuisance mainly because they have great survival skills and they like to sting nearby corals. Aiptasia didn't quite make the top 5 because they can be managed effectively by the introduction of certain fish such as copperband butterflies, peppermint shrimp, or Bergia nudibranchs. Their predators are so effective at eliminating Aiptasia, the concern quickly turns to whether they might starve once the job is done. Also, while they pack a potent sting and can stress nearby corals, the damage they cause is relatively tame compared to the pests that actively feed on the corals. Similarly, Magano anemones don't quite make the cut because it's possible to eliminate them entirely if caught early enough by manual removal. They don't have a particularly tight grip on their substrate, and they can be worked off the rocks and then siphoned out. In tanks with medium-sized populations, you can remove the rock entirely and sit them outside for a week or so just to kill all the anemones. The last honorable mention award goes to bristleworms. They get a bad rap, most of which is pretty unfair. Bristleworms are a very diverse group of invertebrates. Many are harmless and even make amazing detritivores that help the aquarium process uneaten food. It's for this reason that bristleworms are not in my top 5. It's only a small minority that cause all the trouble, and those can be found and removed, especially if we're talking about a large predator, like a bobbit worm for example. If you do this hobby for long enough, it becomes routine to manage the low-level pests that show up here and there. Over time, you learn new techniques that help mitigate the risks of these hitchhikers, and sometimes a new product comes on the market that helps with a particular pest. All that's great. After a while though, something happens that I like to call the Batman problem, so bear with me just for a second. A long-running theme in the Batman storyline is whether Batman is actually good for Gotham City. On one hand, he cleans up the street by fighting crime, but that in turn creates a vacuum that draws in even more dangerous criminals. As time goes on, only the most violent and most deranged super criminals are left. And that's kind of what we do here. We eliminate the gangsters and like the petty criminals in our tanks. And then comes the Joker. And now we have some serious problems that might take some extreme measures to handle. So after all that hype, let's take a look at the top 5. Number 5, redbugs. Redbugs are small crustaceans that infest Acropora colonies. I liken them to fleas that irritate the coral and eventually cause polyps to stop extending fully. A greater concern is the potential for die-off, which can lead to the loss of the whole colony. Acropora are a sensitive species, and the colony can go downhill in a hurry. Redbug issues are difficult to diagnose because of their size. It's very difficult to see one of these specimens unless you know what to look for. They appear as small red dots on the skin of the Acropora colony. One trick to seeing them is to stare at a small portion of the Acropora and just pay attention to anything moving on the smooth surfaces. Redbugs are resistant to many of the commercially available coral dips on the market, which is odd because dips in general seem highly effective against most other crustaceans. Some hobbyists report having success using a dip in either Interceptor, it's a prescription pill for heartworm disease in cats and dogs, or Bayer Advanced Insect Killer, which you can actually find at a hardware store. This dip is great when you can remove the infected colony from the tank. However, in some cases, the colony is too large to remove safely or has grown onto the rocks. In this case, you might consider using a product called levamisole. It's a commercial pig dewormer and it affects the entire aquarium. Remember when we kind of talked about drastic measures? This is a major drastic measure. It's absolutely brutal on many of the tank's inhabitants. It's going to kill all the beneficial inverts, and it's going to stress out fish like you wouldn't believe. It may be a good idea to try to catch all the fish and inverts and relocating them to a quarantine system for a few days. Luckily, there's another method of dealing with red bugs in an established tank where Acropora can't be removed. Dragonface pipefish are a close relative of seahorses, and they act as a natural predator of these crustaceans. They're surprisingly adept swimmers and constantly pick off these guys. Okay, let's move on to number 4. Sticking with Acropora pests, we have Acropora eating flatworms. These guys can be tricky to see, so it's often not possible to catch the problem early. One day, you might see these white speckles show up on Acropora, and then unfortunately you know that you have an infestation. Those white speckles are bite marks where the flatworms were eating the coral, and there's a really good likelihood that they're already all over the coral. There is some good news and some bad news. The good news is these flatworms can be removed by dipping. They let go of the host coral after a few minutes. In some particularly bad cases of flatworm infestation, what you thought was a brownish tan colored Acropora was actually a white Acropora that was covered with hundreds of flatworms. Yeah, that was the good news. The bad news is removing the adults probably won't eliminate the infestation because they lay eggs, and those eggs survive almost every kind of dip. It may take weeks of diligent dipping to fully cure a colony. Let's move on to number 3. Zoanthids on one hand are one of the easiest corals to keep in the reef keeping hobby. On the other hand, they're also one of the most susceptible to a wide range of pests. One such pest is the zoanthid eating nudibranch. This variety of nudibranch was particularly well disguised because as they eat zoanthids, they take on the color and fluorescence of the polyps. After a while, they look like just another head in the colony. Here you can see one that's been isolated. These nudibranchs can be removed by dipping in commercially available dips, but like the Acropora eating flatworms, their eggs survive and can be very difficult to remove. The eggs form a spiral pattern and have a thick gel coat, making them difficult to remove with metal scrapers or brushes. What seems to work better is a dry paper towel. The paper towel dries out the gel coat and are coarse enough to pull them off of the polyp. Despite the effectiveness of dipping to kill the adults and physical removal of the eggs, an infestation of zoanthid-eating nudibranchs is still difficult to manage because unlike many pests that only stick to the coral, these pests are perfectly comfortable roaming the tank looking for new colonies to eat. Even if the hobbyist was diligent and purified every single zoanthid colony, it's likely that these sea slugs are still hiding somewhere in the rock and can re-emerge later. Okay, number 2. If nudibranchs weren't bad enough, there's a second pest that plagues zoanthids, and it's the stuff of nightmares. There's a variety of sea spider that gobbles up zoanthid colonies. If you're familiar with the Alien movie franchise, these sea spiders are the face-hugger aliens of the reef aquarium hobby. They latch onto the zoanthids at the mouth of the polyp and lay eggs inside the polyp. Later, as the spiderlings hatch, the polyp disintegrates into a gray mess. I've isolated one that I found a long time ago. They're super creepy and can cause widespread damage, so if you see your zoanthids staying closed for extended periods of time and then later turn to mush, take a close look for these guys. These sea spiders can be physically removed with tweezers and dental tools. Commercially available pest control dips are also effective at killing them, if given enough time in the bath. The eggs, however, are completely unaffected by either method of removal because they reside deep within the tissue of the polyp. It takes several rounds of removal to get rid of a spider infestation, and can be a frustrating process, especially because during this whole time the Zoanthid collection looks like it's dissolving before your very eyes. Okay, it's time for number 1. And number 1 is the Montipora eating nudibranch, or the bane of my existence. They're one of the most difficult pests to manage and are frequently imported on wild colonies. They're so bad, in fact, that I now consider discarding a coral infested with them rather than trying to eradicate the nudibranchs. The Montipora eating nudibranch is white in color and tiny compared to the Zoanthid eating variety. They can be difficult to spot at first because they tend to start working on the bottom of the colony. Removal of this variety of nudibranch is more challenging than any other that I've had the displeasure of dealing with. First off, they're resistant to dipping. The adults do succumb in time to an aggressive dose, but can shrug off almost any regular concentration of coral dip. The eggs are difficult to remove and require scraping of the coral skeleton to dislodge. Even with careful extraction of the eggs, they're small enough that many go undetected only to hatch later. This past year, we attempted sequential dips to where we dipped certain corals probably 50 times or more. In the end, the nudies seemed to disappear, but then once summer came along, they reappeared suddenly. Given their persistence and considerable damage they're capable of, the Montipora eating nudibranch is a top-tier pest in the hobby today. Hitchhiker pests, unfortunately, are a reality in the reef-keeping hobby. As a conscientious hobbyist, one can never assume that a coral or rock is clean just because it comes from a seemingly good system. Developing a systematic approach to new coral introduction is really worth its weight in gold if it successfully prevents just one outbreak. Some combination of preventative dips and quarantine will help immensely, as will purchasing from aquacultured sources, as those corals are more likely to have undergone dipping themselves. Okay, in a nutshell, that's my top 5 list of horrible pests. Let me know if you agree or disagree, and list your worst in the comments below. Bye guys.